Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Hope you guys are doing well. And it's that time of the week again where we start feeling out the upcoming draft class. We're feeling out the 2024 draft class, and we look at six positions primarily, and we try to find five guys across college football that did something impressive in the most recent week. So we're looking at week four college football here. Pretty interesting week. And there's definitely a lot of stuff to cover. I found five players in each category, no problem. So that's an encouraging sign. That means we've got a lot of interesting things happening, and we've got a lot of potential here. So let's start with quarterback. And my five most notable quarterback performances from this week are as follows. Bo Nix went 28 of 33 for 276 and three touchdowns with one pick. He also ran five times for 9 yards and a touchdown. Now, obviously, Colorado made it easy for him, but that game had such a spotlight on it, and it was probably an unnecessary spotlight because Colorado was nowhere near as good as some people were trying to pretend they were. But that couldn't help but get my attention, even though I understand that we're probably going to look back on that game and say, oh, that doesn't mean anything. Colorado's defense is just that bad. In fact, I think we already kind of know that's the case, but Bo Nix was one of the top performers this week. By the way, remember, college football does that stupid thing with rushing yards where a sack counts for a rush and lost yards. So remember that when you look at some of these numbers for these quarterbacks. Next guy is Cam Ward, and he had a big day against a credible team, the Beavers. That's a real team there. And he was actually better than Bo Nix was even. And Bo Nix barely ever let the ball touch the ground. 28 of 34, 400 yards, four touchdowns, also ran for another touchdown, nine rushes for 14 yards. He has come a long way from last year. And last year I liked him. I liked him last year, but he has come such a long way here. The development from last year is crazy, and I'm starting to think he's going to creep into that second, third round area before this is all said and done. Remember, before the season started, the aggregate had him in like the seventh round. That's definitely not holding. So Cam Ward, great game, put the team on his back, carried WSU. It's not a great WSU team overall, but Cam Ward is making it happen. Also, Drake May had kind of a weird game where UNC scored 41 points, but he didn't have the big numbers. But again, I think we all understand the goal of a quarterback is to lead a successful offense more than put up his own individual stats. So 22 of 30 for almost 300 yards and a touchdown, and then he ran for two other touchdowns. That's pretty good. And again, remember, he got sacked a good amount in this game. I think he got sacked like four times. So that takes the rushing yards down quite a bit, but he does make some things happen with his legs. We also had Quinn Ewers of Texas getting back on track. Not a big game, but a solid game. Almost 300 yards, 18 of 23, a touchdown, and also ran for a touchdown. So, Quinn obviously hasn't reached the peak that he reached against Alabama earlier this year, but kind of getting back into the swing of things. And final spot goes to another guy who made well, not another, a guy who made his inaugural appearance on this list last week, and now I think it's time to start taking him seriously. Jaden Daniels of LSU, 20 and 29, 320 yards, four touchdowns, one pick, and then he also ran for 36 yards. Dual threat. He's making legitimate big boy throws. He's pushing it down the field. He looks like an NFL quarterback, which I wasn't sure if we were going to get this year. So Jaden Daniels is putting up monster numbers. He's putting together big performances. It's time to start taking Jaden Daniels seriously as a pro quarterback, I think. Okay, so that's quarterback. One thing I want to shout out real quick because I didn't have room for it on this list because he was playing like UTSA or something. Joe Milton had an 80-yard touchdown run this week. He didn't play great overall. He played fine, but Joe Milton, like sign me up for that. I know he's not a finished product, but he has some tantalizing abilities, man. I love it. Okay, tight end now. We are going to go through some tight ends that performed big this week. Brock Bowers definitely led the way, and I know Brock Bowers is probably not going to be there when we draft, but there wasn't a great selection of tight ends this week anyway. So 9 catches, a buck 20, two touchdowns. He did have a fumble on his first catch, but he got it back. And Georgia ran the ball all over their opponent. this week, 188 rushing yards, only 1 sack allowed on Georgia quarterbacks. So he's helping out in that area as well. And Brock Bowers continues to be the best tight end in the country by far. Not too far behind him anymore, though, is Jatavion Sanders. He had a big game after being very quiet last week. 5 catches for a $110. Texas ran the ball very well, 175, 5.1 yards a carry, 3 sacks allowed combined on the quarterbacks. Sanders, not a great blocker, but seems relatively adequate to me, honestly. And Cade Stover, my favorite, my man, my absolute crush at the tight end position this year. 7 catches, 52 yards, producing. Ohio State ran the ball productively against a very good Notre Dame defense, 126 yards, almost 5 yards a carry, and McCord only got sacked once that whole game. So Stover's doing it both ways, and he is very, very good at it. Ben Sinnott of KSU, Kansas State, had 5 catches, 64 yards, and KSU ran the ball all over their opponent this week, almost 300 rushing yards, 7 yards a carry, and only 1 sack on Howard this week. So everything's clicking for that KSU offense right now in terms of things that Ben Sinnott can affect. And new addition to this list is Jalen Conyers of Arizona State. He's a late round sleeper right now, but he checked in with a respectable 5 catches for 71 yards for Arizona State. He's kind of lurking around that 7th round range, and we may take a tight end in that range, guys. We might draft 2 tight ends this year. We might take one kind of early and then one super late. Conyers going to put himself on the radar a little bit here as a super late guy. Okay, interior offensive linemen. We've got a pretty good selection this week. Bryce Foster of Texas A&M. Texas A&M ran for over 200 yards on the ground, 6.3 yards a carry, only 2 sacks allowed on the quarterbacks. His PFF grade was not stellar, 61.5, but his pass block grade was really nice, 72.8. 72.8. His run block grade was okay, 57.7. No pressures allowed. Then we have Brandon Coleman, TCU, ran for almost 200, 4.4 yards a carry. Not exactly dominant, but more than good enough. 2 sacks allowed on quarterbacks combined. 64 PFF grade, much better in pass blocking than run blocking. Actually, really good pass blocking grade. And no pressures allowed. Javion Cohen continues an excellent season, in my opinion. I love what Cohen's doing. However, Miami needs to play better competition at some point. 323 rushing yards for Miami on the day, dominant. 7.7 yards a carry. No sacks allowed on the Miami quarterbacks. His PFF grade pushed up to 67.8. Great pass blocking, really good run blocking, no pressures allowed. New name here, Tenor Bortolini of the Wisconsin Badgers. 200 rushing yards, 4.5 yards per carry, 1 sack allowed on Wisconsin quarterbacks throughout that game. PFF grade was just okay, 59, much better in pass blocking than run blocking, and 1 pressure allowed. Finally, Cooper Bebe, still one of my favorites, still one of my top guys. 281 rushing yards for KSU. We already talked about this, but they were dominant in run blocking and pass blocking. His pass blocking grade broached 90. Run blocking, not quite so high, but remember, Bebe's playing tackle this year. I think he'll move to guard in the NFL. No pressures allowed on his quarterbacks either, Howard. Okay, so that's the offense. Now let's bump on over to the defense here. And we had a pretty nice selection of players on the defensive line that stood out in a positive way. So let's run through them. One thing I should note here, pretty much everybody here was graded excellently against the run. So if you're wondering how their run defense was individually, PFF was a fan. So we got Chris Jenkins. He had 3 tackles, 1 for loss. Michigan allowed 77 rushing yards on the game, 3.3 yards a carry, only 250 yards, only 7 points. PFF grade was 80.3. He also had 1 QB pressure. So really nice stuff from a guy who isn't going to put up dominant stats, but is a very apt player down on that defensive line. Very strong player down there. Tyler Davis, similar boat for Clemson. He actually had 6 tackles in this game, and Clemson only allowed 22 rushing yards. And they were playing a good team, FSU. So 1.1 yards per carry allowed is no joke. Only 311 yards allowed total. PFF grade of 73.6. 1 QB pressure. Dante Corleone also stood out to me this week. He's been on this list before, Cincinnati guy. 6 tackles, 2 for loss, 1 sack, 105 rushing yards allowed, 3.1 yards per carry, 82.4 PFF grade, 2 QB pressures. So this guy's starting to be another one of these bigger one techs or zero techs or nose tackles, however you want to put it, who makes plays in the backfield and actually is disruptive. We've got a lot of those guys this year, which I really like. Leonard Taylor finally starting to show up in a more notable way. Although I should say this, Leonard Taylor III has actually been getting a lot of pressure this year. This is just the first time it resulted in anything that stood out to me in terms of actual production. He had 2 tackles, including a sack, 11 rushing yards allowed by Miami's defense, only 280 yards allowed total, 7 points. 6 QB pressures for Leonard Taylor in this game, 82 PFF grade. He's the one guy on this list who didn't grade out excellently against the run, but I mean, Miami allowed 11 rushing yards. What else is he supposed to do? It's pretty good. And T'Vondre Sweat, as always, makes this list because it seems like he's always killing it for Texas. 4 tackles, 1 for loss. I think the 1 for loss was on a 4th down, by the way, so it was a big play in that game. 1 pass deflection, 60 rushing yards allowed by Texas, 1.9 yards per carry, 6 points allowed, almost a 90 PFF grade, and a QB pressure. So again, he's not just taking up space, he's also making plays back there. Love T'Vondre Sweat and what he's doing so far this year. Okay, now we're looking at linebackers. Jeremiah Trotter Jr. finally makes this list here. However, there are a couple of notable caveats here. He did have an impactful game for Clemson, 6 tackles, 1.5 for loss, including a sack. Clemson only allowed 22 rushing yards, which is very impressive, and 300 yards overall, 311, excuse me. But his PFF grade was hit hard by 3 missed tackles and 65 coverage yards allowed. In fact, a lot of these college defensive players miss tackles, so it's kind of a epidemic, but still, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. did get knocked a good amount for those mistakes. However, he did also add 2 QB pressures, so on top of the sack, he also had another QB pressure. He did get beat up a little bit in coverage. I think he gave up 5 catches on 5 targets. So there were some issues, but there's no doubt his impact. Danny Stutzman had a great game. I think he was playing SMU. 13 tackles, 3.5 for loss. Now, he was another guy who missed a lot of tackles, but he also made a lot of plays. He had a sack. He was part of a defense that allowed less than 4 yards a carry, which isn't amazing, but it's still decent. 6 points allowed total, 65.3 PFF grade, 4 QB pressures, so he's blitzing effectively, 25 coverage yards allowed. Pretty dang solid. Danny Stutzman's another guy who's moving up, who's on my radar right now. Junior Colson of Michigan had 6 tackles. Michigan allowed 77 rushing yards, 3.3 yards a carry. Barely allowed over 250 yards, 7 points. 62.4 PFF grade. Only allowed 10 yards in coverage on, I think, 1 catch. So, really good all-around performance by Junior Colson. Cedric Gray, another superstar performance, another standout performance for him. 7 tackles, including 1 for a loss for UNC. 1 pass breakup. 113 rushing yards allowed, 4 yards per carry, 307 yards allowed, 24 points allowed, 80.9 PFF grade, so basically an 81, 3 pass rush pressures, and 21 coverage yards allowed. So he's getting it done as a blitzer, he's getting it done against the run, he's getting it done in coverage. I don't know if it's going to completely translate to the NFL. He is apparently a little bit slow, but if that slowness ends up being something that he was getting past early in his career, I'm really liking Cedric Gray. Final guy is Curtis Jacobs. He basically only made it because he had 2 fumble recoveries in 1 game, and Iowa had 76 yards of offense the whole game. You have to make this list if you're that good. He had 3 tackles, 1 for a loss, and the 2 fumble recoveries. PFF grade wasn't even good, by the way, 54.8, but if you're the lead dog on a defense that only allows 76 yards in 60 minutes and 0 points, and you recover 2 fumbles, I figure you did something right? So, shout out to him. Okay, now we're going to move along to safety here. It was a pretty good week for some safeties. I found a couple of new guys as well that I want to call out. Malachi Moore is not a new guy. He was here previously for Alabama. He had a great week for an Alabama defense that is going to have to carry that team if they're going to go anywhere. 6 tackles, 1 for loss, 300 yards allowed by that defense, 10 points, 69.6 PFF grade, 1 pressure, so he got in on the blitz, and he allowed 4 yards in coverage. So Malachi Moore is quickly becoming one of the most key players for that Alabama team. New guy here is Bew Braid of Maryland. He's starting to get some attention. He had a big game for the Terrapins. 10 tackles, including a half for a loss, one pass breakup, one interception that he returned for 27 yards. Maryland only allowed 376 yards and 9 points. He allowed 9 yards in coverage individually, and his PFF grade was 66.2. So you're getting a little bit of everything. He's making plays against the run. He's making plays on ball carriers. He's making plays on the ball. He's taking the ball away. He's part of a good defensive effort. So Bew Braid, not really a top guy yet, but he's working his way up. Bud Clark of TCU only had the one tackle. He did not have a good week tackling, by the way. He got dinged for a couple of missed tackles, but he did have one interception. TCU defense only allowed 17 points. He allowed 26 yards in coverage, 70 PFF grade. So despite the bad tackling, overall he played quite well. Another new name guy here, although most people will know this guy because he plays for Ohio State, it's Lathan Ransom. He had a monster game for OSU, and they needed every bit of it because they barely got out of there with the win. 13 tackles, 351 yards allowed, 14 points allowed. His PFF grade was almost 67. He also had a pressure, so he came in on the blitz one time and got there. And he allowed 40 yards in coverage. Not great for a safety, but not the worst. And final guy is Kalen Bullock of USC. He had 7 tackles and a pick in that game against ASU. Now, USC's defense was not very good in that game, but USC's defense is never really going to be that good. They don't have enough good players. Kalen Bullock is their best guy, I think, on that defense, and other than him, they don't have a lot going on. They're able to get like 9 sacks in a game like they did against ASU and still give up 28, 30 points because they're not good. So I can't hold that against him too much. He's just doing the best that he can. PFF grade just shy of 80, 15 yards allowed in coverage on 1 catch. So that's a ball hawk right there. Kalen Bullock's definitely a ball hawk. And that's what I got for this week, guys. Those are the guys who stood out to me, guys who are starting to move up my radar a little bit, guys who really just stood out. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later. Let me know what you think. Did I miss anything? Am I overrating anything? Do you think that I'm looking at some of the wrong things here? Let me know what you got. I will see you guys later on. Peace out. Go Hawks.